So what is the physical seat of thought? What is the source of our emotions or decision making, our patience or pains and everything else? Well, it's the brain, and it's said to be the most complex mechanism in the known universe. You might expect to give all it is, and give all it does that will look very pretty, Philips, shimmering light and glass tubes and mysterious colors. But in fact, it looks really kind of gross. It looks the 3-day-old Mitchell loaf. It's great, then you take it out of the head, and inside the head it's bright red because of all the blood. In fact, it turns out very surprisingly that the source of our mental life, of our consciousness, is meat. In fact, you could eat it. People have eat brains. I've had brain with the cream sauce, not human brain, mind you, but I've had brain with cream sauce. It's not bad, but it makes the puzzle all the more hard. Or how can these flesh things give rise to mental life? That's the question I want to explore in this lecture. And the rest of the lecture I want to do by starting with the smallest relevant parts, different parts of neurons. They explore how the neurons are connected together, how they are wired up, how they form different subparts of the brain, like the hypothalamus and the frontal lobe. Finally, talking about the brain and the large perspective, looking at the two halves of the brain, the left half and right half, and how they interact. How there's a lot of stuff in the brain, a lot of chemical stuff, a lot of different parts, but the action is the part that does the thinking, the part that is the focus of most of our research is the neurons. It's not an accident they call the study of the biological basis of thought neuroscience, because it all comes from the neurons. So you can see here pictures of neurons interacting together. Here's a diagram that depicts a typical neuron. So what you see is that dendrites and dendrites receive signals from other neurons, each excitatory like pluses or inhibitory minuses. Then they get to the cell body, which sums up these pluses and minuses. Then you reach a certain threshold, a certain amount of pluses. This natural firing. Firing takes place through the axon, and the axon is much longer than the dendrites. In fact, for some motor neurons, it's very long indeed. These axons running from your spinal cord all the way to your big toe. You could think of it of the relative size of things in terms of a basketball and a 40-mile garden hose. Riding the axon is what's called a myelin sheath. The myelin sheath is, you can think of it as insulation, as fatty tissue like insulation on a wire. So the information comes through the dendrites and silent up in the cell body, and it's transmitted through the axon. So what neurons do is they sum up and transmit information, and we know that there are a lot of them. By some estimates, it's 100 billion. All the estimates tend to be very different and very rough, but these billions upon billions of neurons, and each connect to thousands, maybe tens of thousands of other neurons. So the fact that you have something of this degree of complexity, this degree of structure which there's no way to replicate in any machine. The numbers are just too big, why people might describe their brain as the most complicated machine in the universe. At least this is fitting is made of meat maybe, which is kind of disappointing, but at least it shows its incredible internal structure. So neurons come in three flavors. There are sensory neurons which take in information from the environment, from the external world. These motor neurons which go from the brain out to your motor cortex. So if you touch something hot and you feel the pain, that is sensory neurons. If you rent your hand back or you reach for something, that's more neurons. Finally, these internals which connect different neurons without making contact with the external world. It thought sensation or thought motor action. Now the main thing to think about for neurons and neurons firing is that it's all or nothing. It's like firing a gun or sneezing. Neurons either fire or they don't. Now you might think that's a little bit strange, particularly when you think about sensory neurons, because your experience seems to be a continuum. You have central neurons in your fingers and you could distinct between gently touching something versus being stepped on the tip of your finger of something. But still the neurons are all or nothing. The way we get to this continuum of experience is that neurons can code for intensity in different ways. So one way is in terms of the number of neurons that fire. If X neurons corresponds to a mild experience, X times 10 neurons may correspond to an intense experience. Another factor is the impulse frequency of individual neurons, and individual neurons might denote a mild sensation by doing fire, 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 fire. Well, it might denote an intense situation with fire, 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 fire. So you have neurons and the neurons talk to each other. They talk to each other because axons and axons of one neuron will communicate with the denies of another neuron. A long time ago, people used to think that neurons will wait up together like a computer, but in fact neurons don't actually touch one another. There is a gap between the axon terminal of the neuron and the dendrite of another one. A very tight gap, typically of like 1/110th of a meteorite. This gap is known as a synapse. Then one neuron fires the axon, releases neurotransmitters. These are chemicals that shoot over that gap and affect dendrites and other neurons. As I said before, the effect of these neurotransmitters could be excitatory, which is that they raise the energy, so they increase the likelihood of a neurons firing, or inhibitory, so that they bring down the likelihood of a neuron's firing. What's interesting is that different neurons shoot out different neurotransmitters, so they have different effects on other neurons that they made contact with. In fact, a lot of psychopharmacology both attempts to cure various psychological or physical diseases by giving medicines or recreations. Psychopharmacology designed to increase pleasure of different forms, or sometimes help people walk or help people focus. Works by fiddling with the neurotransmitters, and this can be each antagonist the lower down intensity of things by binding to the dendrites, making it hard to create more neurotransmitters, or they can increase the amount of neurotransmitters available in different ways. Agonist. So you either pumping up the volume or turning down the volume. So you think about different drugs and their effects. This Curare is a drug that used by South American Indian. It's an antagonist. It blocks motor neurons from affecting their muscle fiber. It keeps your motor neurons from working, and what it does, it is pleases you, and in large enough does it kills your, because motor neurons also keep your heart beating. So shut that down and you die. This alcohol. Now alcohol also has an inhibitory effect. You might think that's strange because then I drink alcohol, I get all excited and happy and goofy. But you have to keep this in mind here. The way alcohol works is it inhibits parts of your brain that does their inhibition. So you have part of your brain that says don't say that to the other person. Keep your pants on, stop yelling. And alcohol basically inhibits that part of the brain, making you more exuberant. Then over the course of things, in the course of drinking too much, it also inhibits other parts of the brain. So you could pass out and fall on the floor, and in large enough does it die. So both curare and alcohol in different ways bring things down. Other drugs bring things up. So amphetamines, for instance, increase the amount of norepinephrine, which is another neurotransmitter that's responsible for genetic general arousal, and this is how drugs like speed or cocaine work. Other drugs like Prozac or L-Dopa influence neurotransmitters in ways that they increase, for instance, the supply of dopamine or serotonin, which can be relevant for each, like Parkinson, which seems to be related to too little dopamine, and depression, which is related to too little serotonin. So these drugs work by influencing neurotransmitters, it by directly pumping in more neurotransmitters or increasing the supply in different ways, or stopping them from having effects by binding them or psyching them in different ways. But they work through their effects on neurotransmitters. So the more general idea is that way neurons lead think is that they form cluster of networks. This cluster and networks are computational devices that do interesting things like recognized face, or walking upright, or understanding sentence, or doing math, or experiencing great sadness, or feeling in life, and so on. We know now that that's possible because we create computer machines that works in great ways. That if you wire up a computer machine in create complicated ways, it can do mathematic, play chess, do flight simulator, and so on. So you may be interested in the project of computational neuroscience, which tries to ask the question: how are neurons wired up to do interesting things, and uses our own success at computational level as a model. Then sometimes takes the inference the other way around, which is you can't see how people do it, and they use this knowledge of how people do it to create computational systems that can do it as well. So how is the brain wired up? Well, you might imagine that it's wired up like a portable computer, like a laptop, like the sort of computer you're looking at now. In some regards it is, but there's a couple of reasons why it can be, and both of them have to do with how well the brain works. So first, the brain is highly resistant to damage. If you get a knife to the brain, if you get damage to the brain, it won't typically shut down the whole system. The information and capacity somehow distribute across neurons in such a way that makes them extremely resilient to damage. While in contrast, somebody could open up the back of your laptop, pull out a chill, and the whole thing is ruined. The whole thing will stop working. But the brain is wired up in a certain way that makes it hyper-resilient. The second thing is that the brain is wired up in such a way that makes it works very fast. So computer can do billion of operations per second because there's purely electrical, but brain tissue is much slower and can spend their time to do many steps. So to put it a different way, if your brain was wired up like a computer, it will be so slow as to be entirely unusable. It has to be wired up in a way that's more efficient, that allows for the slowness of brain tissues and neurotransmitters, and can still compute things at a human level, which is often blindly fast. Because of this, there has been a huge interest in massively parallel systems and complicated neural networks, which are wired up as we believe the brain does, and as such we are helping computers to do things based on our understanding of the brain that they could never do before. The details of this is something we are going to talk about throughout the course. We are not actually going to end up explaining different capacities directly in terms of neurons, because we can't, and because we want it to have high level explanation. So then I talk about how people learn language, or how do they recognize face. We are not going to talk much about neurons in particular, but we talk about different brain areas and how they work. Then the assumption is that everything we talk about is more function based, can ultimately reduce down to large networks of neural system, and then in turn will ultimately reduce down to the specific behaviors and of the specific neurons that we are looking at.